Folks, um, I was just reading a timeline, another timeline done by a fan on the whole Scooby-Doo thing. It's at fanfiction.net. I'll provide a link down below. And the way they describe it is they look at, if you look at the three canons, they look at it from a three era perspective. They look at it from a three era perspective. The Hanna-Barbera era, which they believe goes from Where Are You to a pup named Scooby-Doo. The early WB era, which was the direct-to-video movies and What's New Scooby-Doo, to the Mystery Inc. era, which was Mystery Incorporated up to now, including the upcoming Be Cool Scooby-Doo. So, with that said, they, how do I put this? They kind of feel that the WB era, the early WB era, diverts, basically, in a sense, like the Scooby Doo show did, diverts somewhat from canon. It's kind of confusing. Again, I'll provide the link down below. You guys can read it yourselves. But basically, they look somewhat. Basically, basically what they tried to do was put a timeline together that stated something along the lines of canon one, that if you wanted to do a canon verse, basically a continuity universe of the original timeline, and then what you're getting here, and then what we've gotten through the early WB ownership into what they called the Mystery Inc. ownership. Um, Basically, what they look at from a sense is uh, from a sense is they look canon wise, continuity wise, with the original run. They look at the original run as being continuity wise, starting with a pup named Scooby Doo, which was, as they mentioned in the article, is the last of the Hanna-Barbera era of Scooby Doo. It's the last Scooby Doo show under the Hanna-Barbera era, or Hanna-Barbera run. But canon wise, continuity wise, it is basically it is basically the first official canon wise, continuity wise, it's the first story arc in the timeline, and they estimate the pup named Scooby Doo timeline being around 61, 64. Even though, for some odd reason, you had some technology from the modern era, the late 80s, 90s put in there, but still, they look at the Beatles like music that was used in Pup Named Scooby Doo, that is, like the hairstyles, the design of the characters, and they pretty much look at it being between 61 and 64, time wise, decade wise, yearly wise, and from a continuity canon standpoint, it being the first, uh, you know, the first adventures that Mystery Inc. would ever have, and that continuity canon wise through that timeline, as confusing as it sounds, would lead us into Where Are You Scooby Doo, which was the very first Scooby Doo show, but from a continuity canon standpoint, would be like the second would be the second run of adventures and stuff for Mystery Incorporated. So they would take a look at that. I think they would, so they would take a look at Where Are You, maybe new Scooby-Doo movies, and with the exception of maybe Scooby-Doo Show, but I think Scooby-Doo Show is still in that same continuity. You know, Scooby and Scrappy, uh, even the Scooby and Shaggy stuff, Scooby, Scrappy, Shaggy stuff, and then Mystery Incorporated, 13 Ghosts, and then, you know, um, like I said, a pup named Scooby-Doo. You know, they look at everything Hanna-Barbera wise as being continuity, and then they take a look at like at the WB and everything else, kind of like diverting away from that. And then they talk about how Mystery Incorporated, had to take place after Where Are You, Scooby Doo, except I think they forget that if you watch the very last episode of Mystery Incorporated, in those very last scenes, you get the idea that Mystery Incorporated was basically before Where Are You. And again, I know it sounds confusing. I'll provide a link to this article, if you will, at fanfiction.net at the message boards there, so you guys can read it yourself. Uh, Honestly, in my opinion, you know, I look at it like this. Timeline wise, I would agree that timeline wise, okay, if you wanted to go in a non-confusing way, I look at it this way. I do agree, continuity, canon, timeline wise, Pup Named Scooby Doo came first. I agree on that. I agree, as confusing as it sounds, that Mystery Incorporated, the ending of Mystery Incorporated, the very last scenes in the very last episode, keep that in mind, that the very last scene in the very last episode of Mystery Incorporated, that comes, that takes place years after Pup Named Scooby Doo, and then that one little epilogue scene that basically puts Mystery Incorporated into the Where Are You timeline. Where Are You comes afterwards. So there's your first canon-wise timeline, continuity-wise. There's your first indication of Mystery Incorporated. Pup Named Scooby Doo, the ending, the new Where Are You timeline, alternate timeline, as confusing as it was at the end of Mystery Incorporated. Uh, that's basically in the Where Are You timeline, because that leads into Where Are You from a continuity standpoint. But like I say, from a continuity standpoint, it takes place right in there. I mean, I know it sounds confusing, and like I said, you have to watch the last moments, the last scenes, if you will, those last 5 minutes, if you will, of Mystery Incorporated, the last episode, to know exactly what I'm talking about. And again, that's what basically leads us into Where Are You? And then that, if you want to count, the new Scooby-Doo mysteries, you can count them. But I'm sure some people might take that off the list. Maybe, I'm not really sure. But then after, new Scooby-Doo movies, continuity-wise, if you want to put them in the continuity, that's fine, because that actually works. Um, right after that, you have Scooby-Doo Show, which introduces us to Scooby-Dum and Scooby-Dee. and it furthers the adventures, and then you get into Scooby-Doo Scrappy-Doo show, which in the first season or so, which had mystery incorporated, and then of course you take a look at the seasons that followed that, and if you want to add those seasons into continuity, sort of being like, okay, everybody took a break, they went their separate ways and all that, that's fine. But if you want to skip those and then go into the all new Scooby-Doo Scrappy-Doo show slash new Scooby-Doo mysteries as being part of the continuity, and then along with 13 Ghosts, there you go. That, in a sense, depending on how you want to place new Scooby-Doo movies, if you place them in there or not, or even the 1980 to 1983 run of Scooby-Doo Scrappy-Doo show of the 7-minute shorts. Like I said, depending on how you want to, view it, or how you want to look at it, that right there, in a sense, is a more clearer continuity, canon continuity timeline, if you will. When I look at the early WB run with the movies and everything, I look at that as being a reboot. I look at it as them trying to reboot the series with that classic feel. That's what I look at. I see Zombie Island as being the reestablishment of the Scooby-Doo franchise in a rebooted environment. I see What's New Scooby-Doo as being that rebooted version of Where Are You? I look at it like that. I look at it as being that rebooted version of a more modern take on Where Are You? So that's how I look at it. And then I look at the Mystery Inc. era, as they put it, and I look, like I said, I look at Mystery Inc. and unlike anybody else, at first I thought, okay, it's a good show, but it's not as good as it should be. It's not, the Scooby Doo we know of. But to find out that it's basically, the whole thing has been basically a, prelude, if you will, that basically everything, okay, that basically everything, like I said earlier, at the end of the show, basically is restarted, rebooted, and basically the ending of the show becomes the prelude to Where Are You? I'll give it credit there. I'll give it credit there, but I look at that as them trying to capitalize, and I've talked about this before. I look at them as trying to capitalize on the whole teen drama deal, is what I look at. I look at them as trying to capitalize on that whole Twilight Hunger Games phenomenon, if you will, with this presentation of Scooby Doo. That's how I look at it. And I know some people may or may not agree with me on that. So, but again, that's just my opinion, and I'm sticking with that. But like I said, I think a more clearer timeline is, yes, canon and continuity wise, yes, what happens in Pup Named Scooby Doo does come first. The ending, the rebooted ending, if you will, to Mystery Incorporated, the new timeline and all that, that takes place, which basically is the Where Are You timeline, takes place right after A Pup Named Scooby-Doo and leads into Where Are You, which then Where Are You leads into, depending on how you want to look at it, either new Scooby-Doo movies or Scooby-Doo show, which leads into the Scooby-Doo Scrappy-Doo show, which, depending on how you want to look at it, you can either include the 1980 to 1983 run, or you can just include the 1979 run, and then the 83 to 84 run, and 84 to 85 in run with all new Scooby-Doo show, all new Scooby-Doo Scrappy-Doo show, and slash Scooby-Doo new Scooby-Doo mysteries, as well as 13 Ghosts. So that's how I think you can